Okay, it is 3 o'clock, and I'm going to read the Yolo County Land Acknowledgement Statement. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered for this meeting. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people, including the Yocha Dehe Winton Nation today. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be working here today on their traditional lands. And Mike, I'm
Okay.
turning it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Joan. Well, welcome everybody. So today on this hot day, good time to be inside, I think. And summer does seem to be coming early, but as we were talking, it's going to rain next week maybe. So we'll see, up and down. But today we have City of Davis Sustainability Coordinators Don Calciano. Hopefully I pronounced that right, Don, and Jennifer Gilbert, talking about sustainable gardening. First, I wanted to just mention last session, a question had come up about using heat mats to germinate seedlings, and I don't use them, so I didn't know, but I looked it up for how long you use them, and turns out you really should turn them off once the seedlings come poking through the ground. So not for much longer than that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, we talked about planting tomatoes deep. But if you were to buy one of the grafted tomatoes, apparently you should not plant those deep, which kind of makes sense. I mean, that graft is probably susceptible to bacteria. So just something to watch out for. And so I don't forget, next session, which will be May 11th, we're going to have Liberty Galvin, who's a weed science PhD, and a Yolo Master Gardener, talking about the safe and effective use of herbicides and insecticides in the garden. So definitely something to watch for. Even if you're using organic insecticides, they still can be dangerous. They still kill things. So definitely something to learn about. But okay, with that, Dawn and Jennifer, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. So I'm Jennifer Gilbert. I am one of the conservation coordinators with the city. My specialty is in solid waste and recycling. And my coworker, Dawn Calciano, is with me. She's also a conservation coordinator, and she primarily focuses on water conservation. So we've offered this course a couple different times. So I'm very grateful for the Master Gardeners to invite us to talk about sustainable landscaping, sustainable gardening. It's sort of a different look at gardening, specifically through an environmental lens, to look at the practices that we do in our gardens and how we can consider the environment while we're doing our gardening, while we're planning, as we're doing things in our yard. So when we're thinking about the environmental benefits that come from looking at gardening through a sustainability lens, there's a lot of different benefits to it. I mean, we could save water. It actually can mean less work sometimes, which is nice. If you're choosing the right plant, we don't have to prune it as much. We don't have to worry about as many pests and diseases, so there's not as much work on our ends. It also, we can see benefit from additional wildlife habitat. We can create more healthy soils and less runoff from stormwater. So there's a lot of benefits that can come with sustainable landscaping. Next slide, please. So first of all, before we talk about all these individual different types of ways that we can be sustainable in our gardens, the first thing to think about when you're gardening or landscaping is, of course, what our goals are. If you're planning on growing food, you're going to be looking at different things. You're going to be considering different types of plants and different irrigation needs, which is going to affect all these choices that you make as far as irrigation, plant layout. So think about what your goals are. Do you want to grow food? Do you want to have wildlife habitat? Or do you just want color? You want color year round, flowers year round? What are your goals? So focusing on what your goals are first, write those down maybe, and then kind of take from there how you might incorporate all these different sustainability elements into your landscaping. Next slide, please. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and I'm going to go on for a little while about this, so bear with me, is stormwater. And this is not something that is typically considered when you're talking about landscaping, except that, people, you got your downspout from your house, people connect it to one of those pipes so that it goes out to the street. And then after that, we don't think about stormwater anymore because we're just concerned to make sure that our yards don't flood when it rains. We just want that water off of our property. Well, stormwater, when you're talking about sustainability and how we can make our yards more environmental, is a huge deal. There's a lot of elements to it. And I'm going to cover just some of them right now, but there's more. So the first thing to think about with stormwater is that we want to try to keep rainwater on site. Instead of just connecting those downspouts to pipes and running out to the street, we want to think about if we can redirect that water onto our landscaping. And that's really important for a number of reasons. First of all, we'd like that water to stay on our property and soak into the soil so that we can recharge the aquifers so that the water can get down into the roots of the plants and the trees. We really want to keep that on site. The other thing that's really important is that if we can keep that water on site and we can slow it down a little bit. So rather than those downspouts going to the driveway maybe, and then that water rushing really quickly off the driveway, cleaning our driveway of any possible, automotive fluids that might be there, any dirt or anything else, and cleaning that all off, and then it goes away. Well, it doesn't go away. That water goes directly to local wetlands and waterways. It's not cleaned. So water that runs down the gutter into the storm drain goes directly into wetlands. So if we can slow that water down, it's not creating as much runoff. It's not eroding the dirt. It's not carrying pollutants into the storm drains and out to wetlands. So think about that water that goes down the street gutter. Think about that water going into a fish tank. If you don't want it in a fish tank, it shouldn't be going into the street. So dirt is actually a big pollutant. It's a big problem for stormwater. So we want to think about our yards and how we're landscaping and the types of plants and stuff that we do. Try to create swales where the rainwater can kind of go through a grassy area, or even rocks where it can slow the water down, soak into the soil a little bit, not create runoff with dirt where it's washing everything off. Try to incorporate rain gardens, dry creek beds, and rain barrels. Someone said they had rain barrels. So again, different ways to slow the water down, retain as much water as we can on site. Next slide, please. The other thing that we need to think about is if you want to have some hardscapes in your yard. Okay, so you want to do a patio or a walkway. Traditionally, people think concrete. Well, concrete is one option, but water doesn't go through concrete. There's permeable hardscapes that we can do instead. If we use pavers with sand in between, water can actually soak through there so that when it rains, the water can filter down through those pavers and soak into the ground instead of just washing off like it would for concrete. And that's a benefit. You can also use gravel or sand or decomposed granite, anything else, or mulch, even mulch pathways, so that water can soak in rather than running off. Next slide, please. Another consideration, and this is one that a lot of folks don't think about, is if you have mulch in your front yard, which is great because it's good for plants, think about what happens when it rains a lot, or if we get a lot of wind. Is that mulch coming off of your property? Is dirt coming off of your property when it rains? Is it kind of sloughing off with the rain? And if it is, you might want to think about putting up some barriers around the perimeter of your property to keep the mulch and dirt on your property and off the sidewalk. Because again, if it's going onto the sidewalk when it rains, it's going to get washed off. It's going to go in the storm drain. It's going to go to the gutters. It's going to go to the wetlands. And again, if you don't want it in your fish tank, you don't want that stuff going into the wetlands because that's effectively what it's doing. So coming up with some sort of a barrier where you can keep mulch and soil on your property is ideal. So think about this as you're starting to consider your designs, or if you're looking at your yard right now and going, oh, wow, that's right, I do lose a lot of mulch every time it rains. Think about what you could do to kind of prevent that from happening, to hold that material on site. Next slide, please. The other thing, of course, is that if you're having soil or mulch or sand or anything delivered, think about where it's placed and what happens afterwards. Because you'll have a big pile in the street maybe, and then it's blocking the gutter. And then if it's going to rain, like it's going to rain next week, where's that dirt going to go when it rains? It's preventing the storm water from flowing in the gutter. It's going to back up all the water into the street. It's going to create a muddy mess. All that dirt is going to go down the storm drain, again, causing pollution and causing a problem. This picture at the bottom is a fantastic one. The pile of mulch is right next to the drain inlet on the street. So when water goes through that little hole by the sidewalk, that does go directly to the wetlands. So all this mulch, a lot of it's going to wash down there if it's not removed quickly. So consider to cover piles and stuff like that if it's going to be raining, and keep it off the street if at all possible. Speaking of soils, When we typically talk about soils, folks think about the three soil types: clay, sand, silt, and the combination of these three that different types of soils have. You might have a loam, which is a good combination of all three of those. You might have clay soil like we do in Davis, which is heavy on clay and lighter on sand and silt. Or you might have, where I grew up, sandy soil, where it's mostly sand. And, geez, you cannot keep water in that soil. The good thing about clay, I know we get frustrated with digging in our hard clay soil, but it holds water really well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can test what kind of soil you have, which is an important consideration for sustainable gardening, because you need to know what kind of soil you have in order to figure out how often you need to irrigate so that you're not overwatering, you're conserving water as effectively as possible, and to know how much fertilizer you might need to add, because maybe your soil already has a really good level of potassium and maybe you don't need to add any more of that. And adding more of that might actually create more runoff of that and cause environmental concerns that way. So knowing what your soil is, how it behaves, is actually an essential part of gardening, in consideration of the environment. So there's different ways that you can test your soil in these web links. We actually have this presentation already posted on our website, so you can actually click on these web links. But there's different ways that you can test your soil. Next slide, please. The other important thing about our soil is that it is more than just minerals and nutrients. Our soil is alive. And the healthier our soil is, the more alive it is. It contains a lot of different organisms, bacteria, fungi, beneficial and non-beneficial as well. But our soil is alive. And just like any living thing in the environment, the more we nurture it, the healthier it is. So by nurturing our soil, by adding organic matter to it in the form of compost and organic fertilizers instead of synthetic and chemical fertilizers, we can really draw out the best of our soil. And healthy soils mean healthy plants. So if you start at the ground up, build up your soil, have a healthy soil, you'll have a better garden, healthier plants. You'll have worms, you'll have all sorts of wonderful things happening in your soil, which will make your garden experience a lot better. So having healthier soil is also important because the deeper the roots can go in your soil, the less you have to water. And when you're watering, you're looking not at just the first inch of soil. Maybe you are when you have seedlings, right? But once those seedlings grow and you've got a fully developed plant, you're not just watering the top 2 inches of your soil. You need that water to go down deeper. Well, how do you get that water to go down deeper? Well, it depends on what kind of soil you have. So again, find out what kind of soil you have. If you have sandy soil, the water is just going to drain all the way through. If you have clay soil, like here in Davis, the water permeates very slowly. So you need to adjust your irrigation to make sure that that water is being delivered very slowly so that it can really soak in and take its time to get down to where those roots are. Because you don't want that water just running off of your soil and creating waste and wasting water. That's not good. So knowing what kind of soil you have and how to water based on that soil is essential. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to, one more slide, sorry. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dawn. So while we're talking about soil and compost, the county is just wrapping up their 2-month free compost giveaway. And I know it's the 27th right now, so you only have a couple more days left, but the county does offer free compost to anyone who lives in Yolo County. It is free, just bring a shovel, bring bags, and go ahead and load up as much compost as you want. They typically do this every fall and every spring. So I think fall, I think they might do it September, October, November, I can't remember, but they'll probably be doing it again. But just a couple more days left of this free compost giveaway. And with that, I will turn it over to Dawn.
We're going to talk a little bit about plant choices. Jennifer covered kind of soil and stormwater considerations for when you're thinking of planting, and when you're actually getting to the point of doing your planting plan, you want to look at choosing plants that are appropriate for that soil and your individual microclimate for your home. You may have, some areas that are like mostly clay. You may have an area of your property that gets more water than others. So you want to be cautious kind of those microclimates. Are you in shade? Are you in sun, partial shade, looking at those different aspects too. You want to watch the spacing and plan for your mature plant size, not the size when you're planting them, but the size they'll be at maturity. And also choosing low water use plants. So doing water conservation, that's kind of probably the thing that I tend to focus on most, at least in my own landscaping, is choosing the low water use plants. Consider native plants because they provide additional benefits besides just being low water use. They often have less maintenance. They're more drought tolerant because they grow better in this area, but they also provide pollinator and other habitats. So consider other benefits like pollinators, like I just mentioned. Remember that even low water plants, though, do need water during establishments. You can't just plant them and kind of leave them and expect them to immediately be drought tolerant. You do need to be watering them and making sure they've really been able to establish their root systems for at least a year or two. And then at that point, you're likely be able to water them, just a couple of times, each month when there's really like more substantial heat waves. I wanted to mention the water use classification of landscape species. Some of you may already be well aware of that. It's called WUCLs. It's available through the UC Davis website. From there, you can search for, are you looking for a tree? Are you looking for a plant? What area of the state do you live in? It'll give you the water use classifications for those different species. So if you're trying to choose more low water use plants or group them together into what we call hydrozones for irrigation purposes, it's a really good resource that we have available here in California. So that kind of goes into the planting plans and resources. You want to consider your goals, like we already talked about. You want to consider color. Are you looking for things that are really low maintenance, wildlife friendly, native plants? And as I mentioned, you want to group by hydrozone, so plants with the same or similar water needs, because any irrigation area you have on your property, you're going to need the water to the plant that needs the most water in that area. So if you group all of your low water use plants together, then you're able to really water appropriately for those plants, especially if they might be adjacent to like an area of turf. Planting plans and resources. We're very lucky that we have the UC Davis Arboretum nearby. We have a lot of resources kind of, in our local area here. So the UC Davis Arboretum has a number of planting plans online. There's an example of their low maintenance plan here on the screen. The Calscape Garden Planner is another resource where you can answer a few questions and get recommendations for different plants for your area. There's also the Homeowner's Guide to a Water Smart Landscape, which is specific for the Sacramento area and kind of irrigation and planting needs for this area. And those will, as Jennifer mentioned, this presentation will be available on the city's website, or it already is. And you can actually click on the links there to access these resources. So irrigation planning is very important when you're looking at modifying or adding a new landscape. If you're installing a new irrigation system, you want to hold on to those as-built plans because they're really helpful for future maintenance. Many of us, if we weren't the original owners of the home, we may have no idea where the irrigation lines and other things are running underground unless we've had to go in and make repairs. So if you are putting in a new system, hold on to those plans. It might really help you in the future. Determine the type of irrigation that's best for your landscape. Does drip irrigation work? Do you need some soaker hoses for trees? Do you still have a turf area and you need some sprinkler or spray irrigation? What type of nozzles are you using for that? And also consider pressure regulation, especially if you're converting to a drip system and you had a spray or like sprinkler irrigation system, you may have too much pressure and that can sometimes blow the emitters off. So you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate pressure regulation for your property. If you're updating your irrigation system, so you already have one in place, you might be like my property here in town where the irrigation was installed years ago and it was maybe before there was as many water conservation kind of regulations and considerations. So you can consider doing matched precipitation rate nozzles. They're called MPR nozzles to really kind of get the water that your plant needs and to have differing watering needs all receive the amount of water that they require. Looking at pressure regulation within the spray bodies can improve the performance and make sure that you're not having sprinkler heads that are breaking because they get too much pressure or not operating properly because they get too little pressure. And for drip, you want to look at pressure compensating emitters because they'll deliver an even flow of water even when there's changes in pressure across like your drip line. So as we were just talking about drip irrigation, so there's a lot of advantages to converting to drip. It's more efficient if it's used properly. It provides water directly to the plants and near the plant roots, minimizes evaporation because, again, it's applying that water more directly instead of kind of spraying it up into the air. Also promotes a good soil water environment and avoids a lot of overspray and runoff. That being said, there are some disadvantaged emitters can clog. It may not be as easy to see if things aren't working properly, especially if you've put the drip lines underneath mulch or even buried them in a trench, or if you have something like Netafim where you've got the drip irrigation or the mats that are under the ground. It can be a little bit more difficult sometimes to know that there's an issue with the irrigation. And they can be damaged by animals. Animals do kind of like to get into and chew up some of the drip line trying to get to water. Also insects and humans, you go in to plant a new plant and you didn't realize, oh, the drip line was buried under here, and you accidentally, get your drip line instead. So when you're planting and there's existing drip irrigation, it's best to try placing the plants next to the drip emitter. That way you're not having to modify your system. You can get things like the drip irrigation, the little lines called spaghetti, and you can have those go out to where the plants are. But if you've got them kind of already set up, you're going to be able to get the more optimal amount of water to that area. So irrigation timers. So this is actually something we've seen kind of at the city, kind of anecdotally, but from people reporting back to us, a lot of issues with irrigation timers, especially when they've either been off for a while or there's even been brief power outages. So you want to check your irrigation timer. If it has a battery backup, replace the batteries as needed. Run the system briefly to look for broken sprinkler heads and lines. You also want to check that if there's been a brief power outage, sometimes they'll reset to a default. Sometimes if they're older and they're starting to have not function properly, they'll actually kind of run on their own schedule. So you'll start seeing these really unusual water use patterns. And if you had it set up where you're watering at night, like is recommended, or, early morning like is recommended, you may not realize that there's an issue with your irrigation system unless a neighbor or somebody happens to notice, or it becomes enough of an issue that you start seeing water run off. So as you're turning your system back on here in the spring, if it's not on or you've recently turned it on, it's a really good idea just to run the system manually, station by station, and just check that everything is functioning properly. So consider installing a weather-based irrigation controller with a rain sensor. You can install just a rain sensor. You can install the controller that also includes the rain sensor or weather station. That can be really helpful, especially with all the rain that we had. Some people kind of set it and forget it. And if you even if you're setting it and you might modify it, once or each season, you could still have significant rain and not have remembered to turn off the irrigation. And then you've got irrigation running during the rain, whereas a rain sensor kind of just works like an interrupter switch. And once it gets wet enough, it will actually turn off the system. And then once it dries out, it'll turn that system back on. So it's a relatively inexpensive thing that can be added to your irrigation system, either wired or wireless. Be mindful of watering restrictions, the days per week, the time of the day, what's, required. I don't know if most people, on the call, if you're in Davis, if you're in Woodland, if you're in one of the surrounding areas, just check the city's website to find out what your most recent watering restrictions are. And for here in Davis, actually in Woodland too, you can water your water use with AquaHawk. So AquaHawk is our customer water use portal where you can view your daily and hourly water use. I think it's really interesting to be able to go in there and actually see when your irrigation is running and how much water it actually uses. Because for most people, it's surprising to see that jump in water use and how much irrigation uses, even for, in my case, like a smaller property. So irrigation in the spring and summer, landscape water needs increase in the spring and summer. I'm sure that's not a surprise, especially with this past winter with how much rain there was. Hopefully everyone's irrigation systems were off. But as we're turning them back on, we get warmer weather. You see more evapotranspiration as the loss of water to the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. We have little or no precipitation. We may have some coming up here, but it tends to be a lot more sporadic as we get into the spring and summer. Occasionally had a day or two of water, rain in June, but we don't really count on that water as much moving into the spring and summer for irrigation purposes. Average summer, May through August water use is about 17 CCF for here in Davis. That's approximately twice the winter average, which is usually around like 8 CCF. And that's primarily due to heavier irrigation use, not like the number of people, but really we see kind of the irrigation use ends up being like 50 to 65% of water use in the spring and summer months. And tree watering. So tree watering is very important to remember that you still need to water your trees even when we're in drought conditions. It's not limited under waterways prohibitions or the days per week irrigation restrictions that the city of Davis has. That may also be, each city is a little bit different, but most will still allow for tree watering, even if the sprinkler or spray irrigation has been limited. It's essential to water your trees during the hot, dry summer months. You don't want to forget that they do need some supplemental water, even if you have more kind of climate-friendly, drought, tolerant trees. Overhead spray is not a great option for tree watering. They really like to have water, down to the roots. You don't want water against the tree trunk because that can create a kind of ideal habitat for fungus to grow. And adding mulch about 3 to 5 inches, just don't put it right up against the tree trunk. You want it out a little bit. It can really help keep kind of water down in the soil through the summer months and provide that to the tree roots. So young trees need about 10 gallons of water once a week. Mature trees are going to need supplemental water during the hot and dry, like summer months, especially if we have a prolonged heat wave. And the type of tree, it depends on the type of tree you have in your property and the location, how much water it might actually need. And so there is some information on both the city's urban forestry page and Tree Davis's website that talks more about watering needs for trees in kind of different stages of their life cycle. Talk about gray water. I'm not sure if anyone on this call has a gray water system, but gray water is untreated wastewater that hasn't been contaminated. Usually what that means is it's wastewater that's coming from bathtubs, showers, bathroom sinks, and clothes washers. It's not kitchen sinks or dishwashers that can have bacteria and other things in it. So it's gray water from water from particular sources. The most common type is a laundry to landscape gray water system. Those typically don't require a permit, but there are limitations. That water cannot go into a spray irrigation system. You can't be aerosolizing it. You can't allow it to pond. It's only for exterior use, and it has to be subsurface, subsoil irrigation. We do have information and gray water presentations available at savedaviswater.org, which is the shortcut to the water conservation pages that the city has. So we've already talked about this a little bit too, but encouraging beneficial species, considering pollinator plants, encouraging bees, butterflies, and birds on your property, knowing your good versus bad bugs, and especially knowing maybe the different life cycles of the good versus bad bugs. We were looking the other day at pictures of ladybugs when they're an adult and when they're a larva. And when they're a larva, they kind of look like they might be something that doesn't belong on your property, but they're a beneficial insect. So being aware of the different life cycle stages and what different things might look like so that you're encouraging the kind of good bugs that might help out on your property. Considering installing bat or barn owl boxes. Bats can help keep insects under control, and barn owls can help control rodent populations. Then we talked a little about mulch. So increasing soil water retention, using mulch. It also keeps soil and plant roots cool. It helps to keep the dirt on site, like Jennifer was talking about, keeping it out of the storm drains. Reducing weeds. If you've got a thick enough layer of mulch, you can help reduce weeds on the property. And you do have, as Jennifer kind of talked about with the stormwater, you do need to have a way to make sure you keep the mulch on site, whether that's like putting some kind of barrier, having like some larger plants as a barrier. There's a lot of different options, but keeping that from becoming an issue with stormwater drainage. A 4-inch layer of mulch is a good amount of mulch to use, but like we mentioned, you want to avoid having it directly against the tree trunk. And I'm going to turn things back over to Jennifer.
Okay, thanks, Dawn. This is the part of gardening that always really excites me, is different ways that you can reuse things in your garden, because the possibilities are completely endless here. But if you're thinking about making raised beds in your garden, instead of going directly to a lumber yard and buying brand new wood, there's so many different options for getting reused wood that are cheaper or sometimes even free. A lot of people are replacing fences right now because of the windstorms that we had and all the fencing that fell down. I made beautiful garden beds out of fence boards. And yeah, they're not going to last forever because the wood is old and it's thin, but it was free. and I can rebuild them anytime I need to by getting some new boards. So think about creatively, what can you use that's already in existence to create something for your gardening? Because part of sustainability and watching our environmental footprint means using less. So instead of going out and buying something brand new, what can we already use that's already here? Or what can we get that is, already used someplace else from a thrift store or something? The Yolo County landfill has a thrift store that is an amazing resource for anything in your home or garden. But they also have reused lumber when people have a building project and they recycle their lumber. You can get 12-foot 2x6s for $2. It's amazing what you can find there. So there's ways that you can build things out of wood that's even sustainable just because the wood has already been used. It's already had a chance and you could use it again. So mulch you can buy, sorry, I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. There's more amazing things you can do. You can get mulch for free from tree removal companies when they're chipping a tree. I've had luck with just, flagging one down when they were in the neighborhood and asking them to drop off the wood chips in my driveway. You could also use a company like, or use an option like Chip Drop, an online service where you can put your address in and then arborists will let you know when they're in the neighborhood. I found you have a lot more luck getting chips in the winter and fall than in the summer and spring, because in the summer and spring, there's not as much tree work being done sometimes, and then everybody wants the chips. In the wintertime, people are not as interested in gardening and getting wood chips, and so you can get chips a lot faster that way. But that's a great way to get some mulch that you can spread in your yard. You might want to think about certain trees you might not want the chips from, if there might be seeding in your yard, or they might have some allelopathic chemicals or something in the wood or leaves that might be challenging to your garden. So something to keep in mind. But just think about what other fun ideas that you could use to reuse things in your garden. You can make little miniature greenhouses for your small plants out of milk cartons by just cutting the bottom of the milk carton off. Make sure you put a stick in through that top so that the wind doesn't blow the milk carton away. You don't want to create litter with this. So the picture down there are some sticks in there to keep that milk carton from blowing away. You can make little tiny plastic seedling pots at a newspaper. Like I said, it's endless. So just think about what your needs are in your yard and how you might be able to meet that need with something that has already been used once, so that you can reduce your footprint and what you're consuming. Next slide, please. And then, of course, yard trimmings. So I said at the beginning that, one of the good things about sustainable landscaping is that you can think about producing less waste. So less waste doesn't always mean the trash that we throw away. Sometimes less waste means the yard trimmings that come off our property, because it's really interesting. If you think about our yards through the lens of a farmer, okay, so a farmer works really hard to plant and nurture plants of a certain kind. If the farmer is growing plants like corn or alfalfa or something, right? They're putting a lot of effort and intensity into growing this crop, and then they harvest the crop and they take that crop, and that crop is a resource. If you think about our yards, especially if you have a lawn, we grow it, we nurture it, we spend a lot of time and energy making sure that things grow really, really well. And especially in the case of the lawn, people will cut it down and then it's waste. And now we have to pay to get rid of all these clippings. That is a very strange concept, that we are spending so much time and effort to grow something just to hack it away and have to pay to get rid of it. That's a very interesting concept. So what if we flip that on its head? What if instead of thinking about our yards as a crop and start thinking about it and, okay, maybe I don't want to grow a crop. Maybe instead of cutting these grass clippings and hauling it away, maybe I'm going to mulch mow them so that it recycles it on the lawn itself. And then those tiny pieces of grass go back into the lawn and can contribute to the nutrient quality of the lawn, and it's healthy for the lawn, right? Maybe instead of planting this 8-foot shrub right next to my driveway, I want to back it off a little bit so that I am not continuously trimming that beautiful bush. You could see that it was just sheared on the side. I'm not continually trimming it and pruning it. Maybe I'm going to give it some space to grow so that it's not another crop that I have to continually harvest, but then get rid of. So think about what you're planting, when you're planting it, and then how you plan on managing that material. Do we need to harvest things and pull them out of our yard? Maybe we can let the leaves from the tree fall and stay as mulch underneath the tree or underneath shrubs. Maybe we can compost things on site and use the mulch from the compost around the yard, or spread the compost in our garden. maybe we don't need to harvest stuff and throw it away. Maybe there's ways that we can keep this material on site so that we're closing the loop on our own property instead of having to get rid of things. Next slide, please. So speaking of getting rid of things, yes, we all have different ways of getting rid of waste on our properties. Most folks in Yolo County have an organics cart of some kind where they can put yard materials, food scraps, food sold papers in. In Davis, you get one for free with your garbage service. You can get additional ones for a cheap price per month. Every area in Yolo County is slightly different with how they have yard waste carts, but pretty much everyone has one at this point or will be getting one soon. So you can definitely use those carts to get rid of this extra material if you can't compost it on site or you just have too much. There's certain things that I won't put in my compost pile. I don't compost anything with thorns. I don't compost anything that might be diseased or is an invasive weed. So there still is definitely, these are fantastic resources. So the thing is, these carts are not unlimited in size, right? You've just got one cart, but there's ways that you can maximize how much you put into these by chopping things up small, letting it dry out first. I'm sure you've noticed when you have a compost pile, you'll build up the pile with lots of fresh stuff. And then after like 3 days, it like sinks. The same thing will happen in your organics cart. So you can fill it all the way to the top and then things are gonna kind of sink and settle out and you'll be able to add more material to it. So think about that, maximizing the space in the cart, cutting things up first. Or if your cart is full, ask your neighbor if they've got some space in their cart. That's another good way that you can maximize the ability to have stuff hauled away. Next slide, please. There's other really fun things that you can do. I think my favorite thing is that you can actually donate your prunings to the zoo. Zoos have very hungry animals and they have specific diets. And if you happen to have that type of tree or bush on your property, you could actually feed the giraffes and I almost said lions, clearly not the lions, the giraffe and the antelope and all those other creatures that are hungry. So that's an option if you'd like to go that way and you happen to have the right kinds of plants. But you can also contact your waste hauler. They can provide you with extra bins to have the material hauled away. You can also contact landscapers to have the material hauled away or tree removal companies. Again, even if you're doing the pruning yourself, if they happen to be in the neighborhood, you can ask if they can chip it for you and leave it on site. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, but it's an option. But again, chipping things up so that you can use the chips, the wood, the mulch on your property is a fantastic way to be kind of more sustainable with your gardening. Again, closing that loop, keeping stuff on site. Because if you think about it, we're growing all these things from soil and we're adding nutrients to our soil, and then you get this big, beautiful plant, and then you chop it off and get rid of it. Well, that has depleted the soil from all of those nutrients that went up into that plant. And we have to add those nutrients back into the soil as fertilizer, as compost. So the more that we can return that stuff to the soil by laying down mulch and laying down compost and composting stuff on site, the better. So keeping as much of this yard material on site is really beneficial as much as you can. Next slide, please. And that's actually, wow, that's the fastest we've ever done this presentation. That's all that we had to present today. Now, as Dawn said, and as I mentioned, this presentation is already saved online on our website, greenerdavis.org. There's a bunch of different resources that we have listed here that you can actually click on the PowerPoint presentation that's on our website to see all these different resources and all the ones that Dawn was talking about irrigation as well. So thank you very much for joining us today and hearing a little bit about sustainable landscaping.
All right, well, thanks, Dawn and Jennifer. Questions? They went so fast, they didn't pause for questions, so now's the time.
I have a question. I'm wondering, if you have any advice on replacing plants with natives, and if you're trying to take out some plants and put in natives rather than just starting a yard from scratch. Does that make sense?
So you're looking at just like removing some existing plants and then replacing them with native plants?
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, honestly, the master gardeners may have, if anyone wants to chime in, they may have a better response than I do. But I think doing any any areas where you can do like small amounts of, switching things over, to me is a great way to go. And then you're also encouraging like, the pollinators and kind of like a mini wildlife corridor in your habitat. You'd want to make sure that you are, like we were mentioning, like watering them enough when you first put them in, because that is a very common
Yeah.
mistake with native plants. And you can hand water it depending on what you already have set up. If you already have a drip system, then you could, add them to the existing drip system. You can also hand water them for, a year or two. You might have to do it a little more often. Then it would be, less frequently, kind of as things, move on. And then making sure you're kind of mulching them and keeping the moisture in the soil. But definitely would welcome if there's anyone from the master gardeners who want to chime in.
Well, one thing is that if you're replacing or planting perennials, the best time to do it is in the fall. And
That's
then
what I thought
plants will
too,
settle
like,
in and
yeah.
they'll get watered, for free, hopefully
Yes.
by the rain, and then they'll be a lot more prepared to handle dry areas. Although, as Dawn said, even if you do that, you will need to water them some, and maybe as frequently as once a week, or in a really hot, dry, windy time, maybe even twice a week, until they get established.
And I would also caution against the concept of native plants, because native to California does not necessarily mean native to Yolo County, native to your yard. I mean, there's native wetland plants, but
Yeah,
that's
they could be-
probably not what we want to be planting.
And that's where that WUCOS list or the Arboretum plant list, especially the Arboretum All-Stars. There's the California Native Plant Society. And you can use, they all have kind of different databases where you can put in, you're looking for something that flowers a particular time of year. Like they let you search by different criteria. So those can be really helpful to find things that kind of, if you want to bring more color to your property, and definitely, planting in the fall. That's a big one that I definitely should have mentioned.
So really the only thing to plant like this time of year would be like bare root fruit trees and your annuals.
Yeah, some of your vegetables or your annuals, things that you might be putting in now. I have planted some in the spring. I'd say those plants never do as well as the ones I plant in the fall, like 90% make it. The ones I plant in the spring, it's like 30%. So they're definitely, I've seen that difference. Sometimes I'm just not patient enough to wait to replace something if something didn't make it. And I experiment a little with my own yard because I will try things in different places.
Yeah,
how they do.
That's how I've been learning. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's a little late for bare root fruit trees. Again, February is kind of the classic time for those, but you may not even find bare root fruit trees right now. They may all be potted up, but yeah. Joan, I think there are a couple of comments in chat.
Do you ever offer a workshop to make a bat box?
Ooh, that sounds like so much fun. No, Dawn and I have not ever done that. We do have a wildlife biologist on staff, John McNerney. And that's a fun option. I don't know if he ever has. I can definitely reach out to him and see if that's something.
Did you say owl boxes also, or just the bat boxes?
I think he's done owl boxes too, like bird, bat, and owl boxes, but I think it also depends on the location and if they're needed in different areas in town. So I think it's not just building them, but him also knowing if they're, there's areas that, if it's an area that already has kind of the amount it needs for the population, or if it's an area where he kind of, he needs more of one of the types of boxes. But we could mention that to him to see if that's an option.
Okay.
Yeah, that's critical, like Dawn said, because I mean, you could set up a box for a creature to, to move into, but if it's in a less than ideal situation, the animal will move into the area and then it'll get too hot in the summertime because there's not enough shade, and then the young will die. And that's not really benefiting the species. It's not really helping anything. So the proper location for these things is critical. And that's one of the things that John covers.
The next comment is, be sure to check if a potential plant you see at the store is invasive.
Very
Good
true.
point.
Yeah.
It's not all, nurseries are careful to not sell you a plant that either may not work well in your yard or could actually be invasive, which means you have a lot of work to do.
That's it.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? No? All right. Well, again, Dawn and Jennifer, thank you very much for doing this. And it's online on the City of Davis website. Is that right, Dawn?
Yeah, it's at greenerdavis.org. That's our main environmental page. And then on the right-hand side, there's a link for workshops. And we have a video recording of the last time we gave this workshop as well as a whole bunch of other ones that Dawn has given about water conservation and I've given about composting. There's a whole list of them there.
Okay, all right. So there's another great resource. The Master Gardener website has, I don't know when this one will get up. It does seem to be sort of random, but at some point it'll be on the Master Gardener website. And there are some of the other presentations, of course, are on the Master Gardener website also. All right, well, thanks.
I think I had one more question.
Oh.
I have a question. Do you use a moisture meter to see if your plants in the garden need water?
So you're talking about like the moisture meter, the kind that you can just take and put in and then like move
Yes.
it around?
Yes.
Yeah, so you definitely can use, I've even heard some people, they were originally made kind of more for potted plants, but some
Yeah.
people use them in their vegetable gardens. They use them in their landscape. Some people even use them in turf because you're getting down a few inches to kind of see what is the soil moisture. Is even if you're seeing like the top part, as Jennifer mentioned, dried out, you really want to see what the moisture is closer to root level. So it's a really helpful tool for that. And you'll know if it stops working for some reason because it just won't, move or change at all.
Okay.
There's also soil moisture sensors that can be part of your irrigation system, but those actually have to be buried and attached to one of your valves to be able to, instead of using weather-based data, it's using the soil moisture data to tell your system to turn on or off. But those can work well for smaller properties. They can sometimes be more difficult in larger properties because you would need enough of them to be, if it's a larger area, to spread them out. To really water properly. So that's another option too.
Thank you. It's a great presentation.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Yeah. Any
All
other
right.
questions? We're
Yep.
good. Bye.
Okay, thanks for coming, folks. Bye. Next session will be May 11th. So hopefully we'll see you then.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.